It was close to midnight, and Chicago O'Hare Airport was the kind of quiet that only happens when a place that's supposed to be busy suddenly stops. The shops were shuttered, the corridors were half-lit, and the only sounds were the distant hum of cleaning machines and the occasional crackle of an intercom that nobody was really listening to anymore. Rachel, a 34-year-old single mom from Memphis, was standing near Gate B-17 with her 5-year-old son Eli draped over her left shoulder like a little sack of warm, sleeping life, his small fingers loosely gripping the collar of her jacket, his breathing slow and steady in that deep, unbothered way that only children can sleep when the world around them is falling apart. Her diaper bag was slipping down her right arm for the 4th time in 10 minutes, and she kept hiking it back up without even thinking about it, the way moms do. Automatic, exhausted, barely conscious of the effort. She had been traveling since early that morning, first a bus to the Memphis airport, then a short flight to Chicago, and now this, a canceled connecting flight to Portland, a storm that the weather app on her cracked phone screen had apparently not thought important enough to warn her about, and a gate area that was slowly emptying out as other passengers called relatives, booked rideshares, or disappeared into hotel shuttles that she couldn't afford. Rachel had already checked. Every hotel within a reasonable distance was either fully booked or charging the kind of emergency nightly rate that would have wiped out the small amount of money she had carefully set aside for the entire trip. She wasn't traveling for vacation. She wasn't traveling for work. She was traveling because 3 days ago, her mother had passed away, and the funeral was in less than 18 hours, and she had promised herself, and quietly promised her mother too, in that private way people make promises to the ones they've just lost, that she would be there, that she would make it, that she wouldn't let the distance or the cost or the exhaustion stop her from showing up one last time. So when the gate agent, a tired but kind-faced young woman, looked up from her desk and explained, as gently as she could, that airline policy did not allow passengers to sleep on board a grounded aircraft overnight, Rachel didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't cause a scene. She just stood there with her sleeping boy on her shoulder and, in the quietest and most desperate voice, she asked again. Not demanded, not threatened, just asked. She explained, in a low and careful tone, that she had nowhere to go, that the hotels were full, that she couldn't leave the airport and risk missing the rebooking window, that she just needed a safe and warm place to sit with her child until morning. That was all. Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes did that thing that eyes do when someone is holding themselves together by the thinnest thread, and the gate agent, clearly torn between sympathy and policy, opened her mouth to explain again why the answer had to be no. And that is exactly the moment when everything changed. Because 3 rows back from the gate desk, half hidden in the shadow of a row of empty seats, a man had been sitting alone with a glass of water, a laptop, and a stack of printed reports that he clearly hadn't been reading for the last several minutes. He was well dressed in the quiet way that people with real money tend to be. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just a dark coat and the kind of calm that comes from never having to rush. Nobody at that gate had paid him any attention, and that was exactly how he preferred it when he traveled. He wasn't the type to be noticed. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business. He had a policy of keeping to himself in airports, on planes, in hotels. It was easier that way, cleaner, less complicated. He had meetings in the morning and a full schedule, and a team that depended on him functioning at his best. He had every reasonable excuse in the world to put his earphones back in, go back to his reports, and let the gate agent handle it. But he had heard every single word that young mother had said, every single one. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place he didn't visit often but had never been able to close off entirely, something shifted, and he set down his glass, closed his laptop, and slowly stood up. The man who stood up was not the kind of person most people would have guessed had anything in common with a tired single mother begging to sleep on a grounded plane, and if you had passed him on the street, or seen him walking through an airport terminal with his assistant 2 steps behind him and a phone pressed to his ear, you probably would have assumed his life had always been exactly what it looked like now, composed, comfortable, and completely untouched by the kind of desperate nights that Rachel was living through at that very moment. His name was Daniel, and at 52 years old, he was the CEO of one of the Midwest's most successful regional airline carriers, a company he had built over 20 years from a modest 2-plane operation into a business that now ran over 200 routes and employed thousands of people across 12 states. He was respected in his industry, known for being sharp and decisive, and not particularly sentimental about business decisions, and the people who worked for him would have described him, if asked, as fair but demanding. The kind of leader who expected a lot because he had always expected a lot from himself first. He wore his success the way he wore his coat, quietly, without fuss, as if it were simply what he was supposed to be wearing and nothing more. But what almost nobody in that airport knew, and what very few people in his professional life had ever been told, was that Daniel had not always lived in the world of first-class seats and quarterly reports and car services waiting at arrivals. There had been a time, long before any of that, when he was not the man making decisions from a leather chair. He was a small boy sitting on a cold airport floor, leaning against a wall with a vending machine humming beside him, watching his mother try not to cry. He had been 7 years old, and his mother had been 29 younger than Rachel was now, and she had been carrying 2 bags, a broken carry-on with a busted wheel that she dragged more than rolled, and a very specific kind of fear in her eyes that Daniel had not understood at the time but had come to understand completely as an adult. They had been leaving, not for a vacation, not for a family visit, but leaving in the truest sense of the word. The kind of leaving that has no return ticket and no safety net waiting on the other side. His father had not been a good man, and his mother had finally found the courage to go, and the only place she could think to go was her sister's house 3 states away, and the only way to get there was a flight. She had scraped together just enough money to buy one-way 2 seats and barely anything left over. The flight had been delayed, then canceled, and the airline staff at that particular airport on that particular night had not been kind about it, and his mother had stood at a desk much like the one Rachel was standing at now, asking quietly, trying not to draw attention, trying to hold everything together while holding her son's hand, and the answer she had been given was cold and unhelpful, and had left them both sitting on that airport floor for the better part of a night until a woman, a complete stranger, a grandmother type with soft eyes and a rolling bag, had sat down beside them, shared a bag of crackers with Daniel, and helped his mother figure out what to do next. That woman had never known what she meant to them. She had probably gone home and forgotten the whole thing by the following week. But Daniel had carried her in some quiet corner of his memory for over 4 decades, not as a dramatic story he told at dinner parties, but as a private understanding, a knowledge that lived in his chest rather than on his lips, that the difference between a terrible night and a survivable one can sometimes come down to a single person deciding not to look away. And so when he heard Rachel's voice at that gate desk, when he heard the particular texture of that kind of exhaustion and that kind of love, because that is what it was, underneath all of it, a mother's love pushing her across the country in the middle of winter to say goodbye, Daniel did not think about policy or optics or what his assistant would think, or whether it was any of his business. He just stood up, the way that woman had once sat down, and he started walking toward the desk. The gate agent looked up the moment Daniel approached the desk, and something in the way he carried himself, not arrogant, not aggressive, just steady and certain, like a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and knew how to fill them without making anyone feel small, made her straighten slightly, the way people do when they sense, without being told, that the person standing in front of them is not an ordinary passenger with an ordinary complaint. Daniel didn't lead with his title, didn't pull out a business card or drop his name like a key card into a lock. He simply stepped up beside Rachel, not in front of her, beside her, which was the kind of detail that might seem small but wasn't small at all, because it told Rachel without a single word that he wasn't there to take over her moment or make it about himself. He was there to stand in it with her. And that distinction, quiet as it was, meant everything. He introduced himself to the gate agent in a low, even voice, explained who he was and what his connection to the airline industry was, and then, before the gate agent could react or ask questions, he made his position clear, not as a demand, not as a power move, but as a simple and reasonable statement from one professional to another that this woman and her child needed a safe place to rest for the night, that the circumstances were about as human as circumstances get, and that he would personally take responsibility for whatever arrangements needed to be made to ensure that happened. The gate agent, to her credit, didn't need much convincing once she understood the situation was being handled at a level above the usual back and forth. She made a call, spoke quietly into her headset for about 90 seconds, and then looked back at Daniel with a nod that said everything had been clear. Rachel had been standing through all of this with Eli still against her shoulder, not fully understanding what was happening. Not sure whether to feel relieved or cautious or both, because when you've been managing everything alone for long enough, you develop a kind of careful relationship with unexpected kindness. You want to accept it, but you also don't quite trust it yet, because in your experience, good things that seem to come from nowhere sometimes come with strings you can't see until later. But Daniel turned to her then, and the look on his face was not the look of someone expecting gratitude or waiting to be praised. It was just a calm, genuine look that said, "This is handled. You can breathe now." And somehow that was the most convincing thing of all. He told her that she and Eli were welcome to stay on the aircraft for the night, that a flight attendant would remain on board, that there would be water and snacks and blankets, and that he had already asked his assistant to rebook her on the first available flight to Portland in the morning, not in the back, not in a middle seat, but in the front of the plane, where she could sit with her son without worrying about space or comfort, or any of the 100 small indignities that air travel tends to pile onto the people who can least afford them. Rachel opened her mouth to say something, to thank him, to ask why, to say it was too much, and Daniel gently held up one hand, not to silence her. But in that way people do when they want you to know that what they're doing doesn't require a response, that it isn't a transaction and doesn't need to be balanced out with words. He reached into the overhead bin closest to where they were standing, pulled out one of the airline's thick blankets, the kind they usually reserve for premium passengers, and draped it carefully over Eli's back without waking him, tucking the edge gently around the boy's small shoulder with a kind of practiced tenderness that suggested this was not the first time he had tucked a child in, and might have once been one of the most ordinary and important parts of his day. Then he looked at Rachel one more time and he said, quietly and without any performance in his voice at all, that his mother had once needed someone to do exactly this. That she had been young and tired and alone in an airport with a little boy who was depending on her, and that a stranger had stopped and helped, and that he had spent most of his adult life hoping he would one day be in a position to pass that forward. And tonight, it turned out, was that night. The aircraft was quieter than Rachel had ever heard a plane be, not the usual pre-flight bustle of overhead bins slamming and seat belts clicking and strangers negotiating armrest territory, but a deep, still quiet that felt almost protective, like the plane itself had decided to hold its breath for the night and give this tired mother and her little boy the peace they had been running toward all day without ever quite reaching it. A flight attendant named Donna, a warm, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had volunteered to stay on board without being asked twice, had set up 2 seats near the middle of the cabin with extra blankets and pillows, had quietly heated up a small meal from the galley, and had placed a cup of hot tea on Rachel's tray table with a kind of wordless efficiency that comes from years of taking care of strangers at 30,000 feet. Except they weren't at 30,000 feet tonight. They were parked at a gate in a sleeping airport, and somehow that made the gesture feel even more personal, more human, more like something a neighbor would do than something a stranger would. Eli had barely stirred through any of it. He was deep in that boneless, total sleep that small children fall into when their bodies finally surrender completely to exhaustion, and Rachel had laid him across 2 seats with his head in her lap and his sneakers still on, because she hadn't wanted to risk waking him, and she sat there in the low cabin light with one hand resting on his back, feeling it rise and fall, and for the first time in what felt like days she allowed herself to just sit still and not problem solve, not calculate, not brace for the next thing that might go wrong. She thought about her mother. She let herself do that, really do it, in a way she hadn't been able to since the phone call came, because there had always been something immediate demanding her attention, some next step to figure out, some practical crisis standing between her and the grief that was waiting patiently for its turn. She thought about her mother's hands and her mother's laugh and a very specific memory of being 9 years old and sitting in the kitchen watching her mother cook on a Sunday morning, the radio on low, the smell of something warm filling the whole house, and the feeling, the particular irreplaceable feeling, of being completely safe in a world that made complete sense. She didn't cry loudly. She just let her eyes fill up and spill over in that quiet way that grief sometimes chooses when it finally gets the space it's been waiting for. And Donna appeared from nowhere with a small packet of tissues and set it on the tray table without a word and disappeared again, which was exactly the right thing to do. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Rachel finally slept. Not deeply, not completely, but enough. And when she woke just before 5 to the sound of the intercom crackling softly with an early morning announcement, the storm outside had cleared. The terminal beyond the gate windows was beginning to show the first gray light of a winter morning, and there was a small paper bag on her tray table that hadn't been there when she closed her eyes. Inside it was a child-sized bottle of orange juice, a granola bar with a cartoon on the wrapper that she knew Eli would like, a clean little folded t-shirt in approximately the right size with the airport's logo on it, and a handwritten note on airline stationery in small, neat handwriting that said simply, "Your car to the funeral home is confirmed for when you land. Take care of yourself today." She read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of her diaper bag, which is where she kept the things that mattered. By the time she had woken Eli up, changed his shirt, smoothed his hair with her fingers, and walked him off the plane and back into the terminal, the airport had come back to life around them. The coffee shops opening their shutters, the morning travelers filing in with their rolling bags and their to-go cups, the whole ordinary machinery of a busy travel day starting up again as if last night had been nothing unusual at all. But for Rachel it had been everything. She got to the gate for the Portland flight with time to spare, sat down in her first-class seat with Eli pressed against her side, watched the runway fall away beneath them as the plane lifted into a pale and cloudless morning sky, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in her chest she was going to make it. She made it. Rachel walked into that funeral home in Portland with 20 minutes to spare, Eli's small hand wrapped around 2 of her fingers the way it always was when he sensed, without fully understanding, that his mother needed anchoring. And she stood at the front of that room and said goodbye to her mother with red eyes and a full heart and the particular kind of strength that doesn't come from having everything go right, but from surviving everything that went wrong and showing up anyway, which is honestly the braver version of strength and the one that most people never talk about because it doesn't look heroic from the outside. It just looks like a tired woman in a wrinkled blouse holding her son's hand at a funeral. But on the inside, it is one of the hardest and most quietly extraordinary things a human being can do. She got through the service and the reception after, and long quiet hour at the end when most people had left, and it was just family and the particular heavy tenderness of a room where someone has just been loved out loud for the last time. And through all of it, she carried with her the memory of that night at the airport the way you carry something warm in your coat pocket on a cold day, not thinking about it every second, but aware of it, grateful for it, steadied by it in ways she couldn't entirely explain. She flew home to Memphis 2 days later, and life resumed the way life does. The school runs and the grocery trips and the bills and the bedtimes and all the 10,000 small, unglamorous details of raising a child on your own without anyone to tag in when you're running on empty. But something in her had shifted. Some small but permanent recalibration had happened in that grounded plane in the middle of the night, and it had to do with the understanding that the world contains more unexpected kindness than we tend to believe when we're in the middle of our hardest moments, and that sometimes the kindness comes from exactly the direction you would never have thought to look. Meanwhile, and entirely without Rachel's knowledge, the story had already begun moving through the world on its own. A woman who had been sitting near the gate that night, a travel writer who documented her experiences in a quiet, honest blog that had a modest but loyal readership, had posted about what she witnessed, describing everything in careful detail, but without naming anyone, without photographs, without any of the sensational framing that makes stories feel cheap. Just a plain and honest account of a man who heard a mother asking for help and decided to stand up. And something about the plainness of it was exactly what made it land so hard on so many people, because everyone who read it had their own version of that airport night somewhere in their memory, their own moment of being stranded and scared and hoping someone would notice, and the story touched that place and people directly and without apology. And they shared it the way people share things that feel true rather than things that feel interesting, which is a different and more powerful kind of sharing entirely. By the time a journalist connected the details and identified Daniel as the man in the story, the post had been shared hundreds of thousands of times across every platform imaginable, and his inbox and his company's phone lines were full of people wanting to comment, wanting to thank him, wanting to tell their own stories of being stranded or helped or ignored. And Daniel's response to every interview request was the same, brief, genuine, and entirely unwilling to be made into something bigger than it was. He simply said that he had done what anyone with the ability to help should do, and that the real story wasn't about him at all. It was about a mother who fought through an impossible night to keep a promise to someone she loved, and that if there was any lesson in it, it was just that paying attention to the person in front of you is never wasted. Not ever. His airline quietly introduced an assistance program for stranded passengers in crisis situations shortly after. No fanfare, no press release, just a practical and human response to a human problem dressed up in policy language, which is often how the best changes get made. And Rachel, sitting at her kitchen table in Memphis on a quiet Tuesday evening after Eli had gone to bed, wrote Daniel a letter by hand on plain white paper. The kind of letter people have mostly stopped writing. The kind that takes time and intention and means something different because of it. And in it she didn't just thank him for the flight, or the car, or the blanket, or the orange juice. She thanked him for the moment itself, for choosing to stand up in a dark and quiet airport when nobody would have blamed him for staying seated, because that choice, she wrote, had reminded her at the exact moment she most needed reminding, that she was not invisible, that her struggle was not invisible, that she and her son mattered to a stranger enough for him to close his laptop and get to his feet. And that kind of reminder, she told him, has a way of carrying a person a very long way. Daniel read the letter at his desk on a Friday morning, read it twice, folded it along its original creases, and placed it in the top drawer to his right. Not filed, not scanned, not passed to an assistant, just placed there, by hand, in the spot where he kept the things that had no business category and needed none. The things that reminded him, quietly and without ceremony, exactly why any of it was worth doing in the first place.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.